Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to one of the partnership talks known as the Closer Looks on Decimus Burton. I am not a great Decimus Burton expert. I'm director of the Library and Collections of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and my interest in Burton is as a collector of drawings, books and manuscripts, and the influence of those objects on his own work, and the peripatetic way in which that work made its way into the collections of the Royal Institute of British Architects and the Victoria and Albert Museum. So, without further ado, I'm going to talk today about some of the, not all of the great London projects by Burton, but some of them for which, between the two institutions, we have significant visual material, and to give you some kind of a feeling of how the drawings and prints and photographs that we are going to explore in the next hour related to Burton himself and his influence on British architecture and the influence of other architects on him. Burton is an amazingly prolific architect, as you probably all know. As somebody who didn't grow up in Britain, I was absolutely amazed how little his name meant to people who have been born here and have grown up here. I consider him not just one of the most interesting architects in Britain in the 19th century, but one of the most interesting cultural figures, and that truly became evidenced by my work on what he collected, why he collected it, and how it related to his work. This is a portrait of Decimus Burton by Ennis in his younger years, and naturally he began, like many 19th century architects and architects before the word architect was properly coined, as a very, very young man. The fact that James Burton, his father, was an exceedingly successful promoter and developer and builder in his own right, and must have been very, very sharp businessman, because very early on he started buying up leases on which many of the structures I'm going to talk about, in fact, were later built. It was James Burton who introduced Decimus to architecture and to what it really meant to be an architect in 19th century Britain. And it shows the perspicacity of the father, that he recognized that for Decimus Burton to become an architect of a certain standing in the 19th century society, he needed more than just to observe his father at work. And the influence of other important people in Decimus Burton's life is evidenced by this absolutely lovely little sketchbook that comes from the hand of George Maddox, himself an architect and a surveyor and an artist. It is a book of sketches of classical monuments. You will have a chance to look at it. I don't want to dwell on it too long, but you see there is a dedication, double dedication by Decimus Burton to the RIBA, recognizing the great influence of George Maddox on his work, and which is really epitomized by the sketchbook. Another influential man in Decimus Burton's early development, of course, was Sir John Soane, professor at the time at the schools of the Royal Academy, where Decimus Burton attended. And so these are truly some very powerful influences early in Decimus Burton's professional work that combined with the fact that he started designing by the age of 16. So there is a very remarkable, though not uncommon, approach. The difference is that not every budding architect had a chance to work on such prominent projects so early in their life. But Decimus Burton introduced to John Nash, the architect for the Prince Regent and later George IV, was right away thrown into the very, very fertile environment of the development of Regents Park. So barely out of his teens, he was working on projects that I think architects of today would kill to be allowed near to, let alone engaged with. One of the villas, as you know, the Regents Park there were a number of schemes for the Regents Park involving the outer and inner circle, the outlying terraces, and then a whole group of villas that are sort of scattered around the inner circle, around the perimeter. One of those villas on the west side of the park is the Holm House. You can still see it reproduced in Pugin's Public Buildings of London as an important exemplar of significant work in the park. The classical influence, of course, on Decimus Burton was the overriding influence that impacted on his architecture. And it wasn't only George Maddox's Sketchbook that had a significant influence on him in this respect. It was his nascent collecting activity, which carried rather early into the collecting of architectural fragments, plasters, which were a fundamental teaching tool, particularly in the 19th century when people were already traveling. There was an opportunity to obtain these casts. The casts were being made, and Decimus Burton, by the time that he decided to stop collecting these architectural casts, had over 200 of them, which was tremendous. So from the sketches of classical buildings that he himself made and that Maddox sort of bequeathed him as his legacy, to collecting the casts, determined where he was looking in the terms of developing as one of the great architects of the Georgian revival. I should say that the V&A is extremely fortunate to have in their collections a sub-collection of the Burton casts, and close to 20 of them are exhibited in the British galleries, and you should go and see them because it just fits so much together with what he was trying to show in his buildings and what he was also, what became manifest in his correspondence, and I'm going to mention some examples in the thing. I will return to Regent Park. One of the terraces on the east side of the park, the Clara Terrace, this is Decimus Burton's design, which ultimately was not used in the way he did design the Clara Terrace. This design was modified. What's interesting about it, here you see how his ideas formed. My favorite building by Burton, bar none, they're not necessarily for architectural reasons, but because it is so inspirational in Regents Park, is the Colosseum. You might be aware that Thomas Horner, a surveyor, and Victoria was very interested in panoramas and other forms of sort of large-scale depictions, was working in the late teens and early 1820s from St. Paul's, drawing parts of London that could be seen and assembling them or hoping to assemble them into a large panorama or diorama to present to the British public. Only with the advent of the Colosseum in Regents Park, this really could become reality. And even though the people who supported it and funded it were bankrupt in short order, and the Colosseum later on had to be destroyed, it must have been an absolutely magnificent form of entertainment. You would like to situate it, if you know the present Royal College of Physicians in Regents Park, built by the Colosseum, that's roughly where the Colosseum had been located. These beautiful watercolor drawings show, even though it was called the Colosseum, it has very little Roman in it, if at all. It is Greek style building with its magnificent Doric portico and a dome, which was, I don't know if just a few inches or a little more, but it was larger than the dome of St. Paul's, which of course is a grand gesture to say, after all, St. Paul's is the defining building in London, and so to build something with a dome larger than St. Paul's was very gutsy and very, very interesting. Decimus worked with Thomas Warner, who designed who drew the sections of the panorama, to be able to both display the panoramic drawings and to, in fact, experience them in situ by climbing on the top of the Colosseum and looking out at London. So together they designed the romantically termed Ascendant Room, which was the first public lift in Britain. It was a truly magnificent project because combining the artistic depiction of a panoramic view of the city with the actual experience was uncanny. It was a truly, I think, revolutionary gesture that Burton sort of realized here, because the combination was a winning one, as we say. If you visit us in Portland Place in our library, you can leave through this little booklet, which was published really mainly for called A Brief Account of the Colosseum, which was published for the investors and supporters of the project. Every section is depicted, and you can compare the larger drawings with this kind of a continuous panoramic slideshow, if you will. The success of the Colosseum at the time, and shall we say, an early renommee that it brought Decimus Burton, prompted the supervisors of Regents Park to approach Burton about another park then in buoyant development, and that was Hyde Park. In Burton's own collection, personal collection, there was an oil painting of what Hyde Park, what the entrance, so to speak, looked like before he got involved. This is the upper is the photograph by Bedford Lanier, prominent 19th century photography agency in London, of the oil painting hanging in Decimus Burton's drawing room. And then this photograph, it remains a little bit of a mystery, because it's also ostensibly taken from an oil painting but that would have had to be following the actual construction of Burton's Ionic screen and the triumphal arch, later known as Wellington Arch. This is an absolutely magnificent drawing where you see in perspective. We saw two structures were originally related. You probably know that the idea behind it was not only to provide a grand entrance to Hyde Park, but to situate the two structures as a formal entrance from the north towards Buckingham Palace. So it was an extension of the structures that was intended it. So when Burton created this great entrance, which unfortunately is hidden behind the Wellington Arch, with a great classical frieze and a quadriga upon the main entrance, and then connected it through these colonnades with the side entrances. It's really, till this day, a hugely appealing structure. And the arch, which emulates a little bit the Arch of Titus in Rome, was perfectly situated to provide that kind of a grand entrance to the Buckingham Palace precinct. Just imagine Burton's shock and dismay when in 1881 his carefully calibrated, beautifully considered quadriga was replaced by the statue of Wellington sideways on the horse. That just completely changed the way the structure had been conceived, and from judging by the correspondence, caused no end of grief to the architect himself. So much so that for a while, in his will, he left a sum of £2,000 to remove this monstrosity from which I thought was just said it all. Just get rid of it. Which it was removed, it still survives, but not blessedly atop the Wellington Arch. The Ionic screen and the arch are part, in fact, of a debate that explored the typology of public and particularly sort of symbolic structures in post-Waterloo Britain. One of the greatest gifts bequeathed on the RIBA by Decimus Burton is a series of 4 paintings by Joseph Gandhi, who you might recall worked for Soane as a pictorialist and as a kind of interpreter of Soane's structures. And these watercolor paintings are part of that debate as well. They were exhibited at the Royal Academy. They were buildings that were to epitomize the grandness of Britain in the post-Waterloo period, intended for the whole series is a series of abodes for imperial sovereigns, that's part of the title, to be constructed in Hyde Park. Gandhi was an incredible artist, but not particularly realistic. Obviously the combination that he liked to use this of Christian and pagan symbolism sort of shrouded in the mist of time might have worked very well and in fact was highly praised when it was exhibited at the Royal Academy in the mid-1820s. But the estimate of cost, namely, and hold on to your hat, £3 million in the mid-1820s for realizing all this, of course, put Gandy's project off the map and replaced it, by then already, in process of being built. The iconic screen and the arch were considered a much more elegant, realistic, and appropriate solution, even though they didn't include any abodes for imperial sovereigns, and on the other hand, a grand entrance to one that already existed. I will return very briefly to the villas in Regents Park that Decimus Burton was responsible for. One of them was a villa for G.B. Greenough, who was a prominent geologist and a founding member of the Royal Geological Society. This watercolor shows the villa in Regents Park, and Greenough, of course, became a very first an acquaintance and then a good friend of Decimus Burton's, and recommended him to the Athenaeum Club as an architect and as a member. And so the connections that we have between our two collections with the whole project of the Athenaeum are some drawings from the that show the plans for the Athenaeum Clubhouse, and relatively recent acquisition by the RIBA of 70 letters exchanged between Decimus Burton and the president of the Athenaeum at the time. So these two relationships, Greenough to Burton and Burton to Croker, are formative in that for the next 40 years, Burton remained involved as an architect with the Athenaeum and as a member with the Athenaeum. This is where he met his clients. This is where he even, welcomed overseas visitors. It became a kind of a home away from home. And the correspondence between Burton and Croker is very interesting in that it is not so much about the club as about the political situation in Britain in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. So in that sense, there is a much larger historical import that bears on the architecture of the club, but primarily shows two well-educated, highly opinionated members of the establishment discussing the political events of the day. The Parthenonic frieze on the Athenaeum, which you cannot see, of course, from the plan, and the statue of the Athena were sort of decorative adjustments to the club that were proposed by Croker, not by Burton himself, and they were installed at great expense in the club. And there is a little limerick, which, of course, because I'm talking about so many different things, I cannot remember, but if one of you knows it, it has to do with the cost of the frieze and what the other members thought of Croker's extravagance. I forgot, when I was talking about the Ionic screen, I failed to show you, and I apologize for it, a presentation drawing for the screen before any additions were made on it that had been signed by George IV for as he gave approval for the construction to go ahead. So I'm always so smitten by this drawing. I forgot about the planar one, but the planar one here has a great significance. The one in Q, the great Conservatory, here in a photograph by Edwin Smith, a prominent 20th century photographer, and the other one in collaboration with Joseph Paxton for the executed for the Dukes of Devonshire. Blown up in the 1920s because the events of the Great War completely prevented the estate to continue heating it. And so tropical plants don't do well in the British climate without some additional heat, and they died, and then it was just untenable to maintain it, and it got blown up. It's a great structure, and it is characteristic that the 6th Duke of Devonshire was so concerned about the size of it and about the original proposal by Paxton that he insisted on bringing Burton in there too, because he didn't want Paxton to go ahead unless Burton stood by as a consultant. And out of that consultancy came another very beautiful gift that just shows the breadth of interest and the generosity that Burton displayed both towards the RIBA and the V&A, and that is really the first facsimile published in Britain by the 6th Duke of Devonshire of the sketchbook by Inigo Jones. So this is not an original, this is a full facsimile done so expertly that it takes a while to realize it's a facsimile and not the original. And it was in recognition of Burton's contribution to Chatsworth that the Duke sent him the sketchbook after the end of the work, and Burton eventually donated it to the RIBA because he felt that it was an important thing to hold. I think this is it for London, but I wanted to take out at least a few drawings of Decimus Burton's work that are not in London. I just wanted you to see the handsome watercolor of the Adelaide Crescent in Brighton, which shows the grandeur of Burton's ideas and the skillful way that he negotiated these very concave nature of the grounds in the main block and the side wings extending from it. And by the way, the concave he learned from Gandhi. Gandhi was absolutely obsessed with concavity, if one can say that. This to show you how little we know our own collections. Still, the RIBA has a modest 4 million objects in their collections. And after I thought that my research on what Burton gave to the RIBA was done and dusted, we came across a number of drawings that are on the side. One of which was this very charming tempietto with classical structures drawn in the back. So something that we call in architectural parlance capriccio, a representation of existing and non-existent buildings in one thing. And we discovered this and other drawings given us by Burton through our digitization projects, because we started going through one of the largest unexplored collections that we have, and that's a collection of topographical drawings and prints, which is only arranged by the place. And in it, we find close to a dozen drawings executed and presented to the RIBA by Decimus Burton that relate to his own work, that are gifts to his contemporaries, and that might, in one way or another, impact on his relationships with what is really a hugely impressive array of cultural figures in 19th century Britain.
Thank you so much, Irena. That was absolutely fascinating.